Okay. Uh, so our topic is nervous system and the communication. So how the communication takes place through nervous system, how the various neurons they communicate with each other, what do you mean by neurotransmitter, synapse, and so on. So those things we are going to discuss today. Uh, Before I start my presentation, let us begin again with one video which we have already seen last time. So the same last time 3 videos we have seen. Out of that, one video I am going to repeat, and after that I will go to the presentation.
Understanding the electrical properties of individual neurons. We learned how electrical forces and diffusion give rise to membrane potentials, and we learned how cells can generate and propagate signals called action potentials, or spikes, along the membrane. Understanding the properties of the neuronal membrane is essential, but understanding just these properties isn't sufficient to give us insight into collective behavior of the billions of connected neurons in our brains. Luckily for us, we can approach neuroscience at many different scales and levels of analysis, and we don't have to confront the full complexity of everything all at once. That's what we'll be exploring throughout the rest of this course as we slowly go from our understanding of single molecules, such as ion channels, to the electrical behavior of neurons, to their collective behavior in small circuits, and finally onto how they become organized in large functional regions of the brain. Let's start simple though. Since we've examined one neuron, a logical next question is how do two neurons connect with one another? We'll first examine some basic cellular anatomy of neurons. So far, we haven't made too much of the fact that the majority of neurons are polarized cells. That is, they have one portion of the cell for receiving inputs and another portion for sending outputs. The parts of the cells that are specialized for receiving inputs from other cells are called dendrites. The word dendrite comes from the Greek word dendron, meaning tree, and as you can see, the dendrites have a branching, tree-like structure. A signal received by dendrite is passed to the cell body. If there is sufficient depolarization of the cell body membrane to initiate an action potential, then an action potential is sent down the axon. The axon then carries the propagating action potential to another neuron. So what actually happens at the boundary between two neurons, between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another? This interface is called a synapse. There are two general types of synapses: electrical synapses and chemical synapses. Electrical synapses are less common in our own nervous systems, but they're simpler to think about, so let's start with that. Electrical synapses are basically pores between two cells that allow ions to pass through. They allow the passage of the electrical signal through to a neighboring cell without much fuss. It's not so different than just combining two cells into one larger cell. There are lots of reasons that nature might need synapses like this from time to time. They're fast and they allow cells to couple together with a high degree of synchronicity. But most neurons are connected together by a much more complicated structure called a chemical synapse. In a chemical synapse, rather than simply passing along an electrical signal from one cell to another, the action potential travels to the end of the axon and causes a chemical to be released into a very small space between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft. This chemical is taken up by the downstream neuron on the other side of the cleft. This chemical signal can cause the downstream neuron to depolarize its membrane, converting the chemical signal back into an electrical one. Or it can have other effects on the cell. This chemical step is slower than transmission across an electrical synapse, but it opens up an enormously diverse repertoire of different and more complex kinds of signaling. and synaptic function plays a critical role in computations performed by neurons. We'll spend the rest of this unit exploring the inner workings of chemical synapses, on our way to beginning to look at how networks of interconnected neurons give rise to behavior. We'll also look at the role of defective synaptic physiology in neurological and psychiatric disorders, and we'll see how synapses can be targeted by various psychoactive drugs and poisons. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at how synapses can change over time in response to external stimuli, playing a foundational role in how we learn and remember.
So it was just introduction how actually the communication takes place within the different neurons. We have seen it happens through two phenomena, either electric synapse or chemical synapse. And the chemical synapses, they pass through a small space called as the cleft. Okay, so all these things we'll discuss further in the presentation. Okay, so last time we had some introduction to the nervous system, the cells of the brain, neurons, different types of neurons, then the different parts of the neurons. Now here what you see, axon. So this axon is actually responsible for communication between two neurons. So every neuron has a single axon whose diameter varies from micrometer in certain nerves of the human brain to millimeter in the giant fiber of the brain. Axons are specialized for the conduction of a particular type of electrical impulse called as action potential. So in unit number 1 we have seen action potential. So in this neuron cells also, neurons are the cells, in these also the action potentials are generated, and this action potential is generated in the form of impulse which travels outward away from the cell body towards the axon terminals. The action potential is a series of sudden changes in voltage or the electric potential across the plasma membrane. When a neuron is in the resting state, the electric potential across the membrane is approximately minus 60 millivolt, which is negative inside relative to the outside, that we have seen when we have studied this action potential. The magnitude of this resting potential is similar to that of the membrane potential in most of the non-neuronal cells. At the peak of the action potential, the membrane my internet connection was lost. I am back again. Am I audible now and presentation is visible? Okay, fine. Okay, let us continue. So we are discussing about the neurons and how they communicate. So we have seen earlier the action potential, which is the impulse of voltage wave, it is generated and it travels away from one neuron towards another neuron. So this action potential in the resting state, it is around minus 60 millivolt, and at the peak of the action potential it is around plus 50 millivolt. That is the positive inside of the cell. So this depolarization of membrane is followed by rapid repolarization, and after that it again returns to the resting state. So that is what we have discussed in unit number 1, and the same thing is applicable for the neurons also. So these characteristics distinguish an action potential from other types of changes in electrical potential across the plasma membrane and allow an action potential to move along an axon without gradual decrease. So as we have discussed, an action potential is a sudden transient repolarization of the membrane which is followed by repolarization to the resting potential of about minus 60 millivolt. Action potentials move rapidly at speeds up to 100 meters per second. So in humans, the action may be more than meter long, so it takes only few milliseconds for action potential to move along their length. An action potential originates at axon hillock. So neurons have 4 important regions: dendrites, soma, that is the cell body, and there is an axon hillock here. So an action potential, it originates at the axon hillock, which is the junction of the axon and cell body, and is actively conducted down the axon into axon terminals, small branches of axon that form the synapses or connections with other cells. The single axon in nervous system can synapse with many neurons and induce responses in all of them simultaneously. Most neurons have multiple dendrites. So as you can see here, most neurons have multiple dendrites which extend outward from the cell body and are specialized to receive chemical signals from the axon terminal of other neurons. Dendrites convert these signals into small impulses and transmit them inward in the direction of the cell body. Neuronal cell bodies can also form synapses and thus receive signals. Electrical disturbances generated in the dendrites or the cell body spread to the axon hillock. If the electrical disturbance is great enough, an action potential will originate and will be actively conducted down to the axon towards the next neuron. So this is what we can see in this figure. The axon potential, it originates at the axon hillock of one neuron and it starts propagating towards the next neuron. Now, what do we mean by synapse? So as you can see here, these synapses are specialized sites where neurons communicate with other cells. So this region, it is shown in the expanded diagram, what you see here. So synapses generally transmit signal only in one direction. An axon terminal from the presynaptic cell sends signals that are picked up by the postsynaptic cell. This we have discussed last time already. Okay. So some chemicals are released in the form of neurotransmitters at the synapse. The two types of neurotransmitters, what I told you earlier, the electrical one and the chemical one. Okay. So this is how the action potential, it originate at the axon hillock of one neuron and it propagates towards the other neuron. Now the neuronal cell where the action potential begins, that is presynaptic cell, and the neuron towards which the action potential is propagating, it is postsynaptic cell. So an axon terminal from the presynaptic cell sends signals that are picked up by the postsynaptic cell. So there are two types of synapses, as I have told you, the electric synapse and the chemical synapse. So in this type of synapse, the axon terminal of the presynaptic cell contains vesicles filled with particular neurotransmitter. So as you can see in this diagram, the synaptic vesicles filled with the neurotransmitters. So the postsynaptic cell can be a dendrite or cell body of the another neuron. It can be a muscle or a gland cell, or even it can be another axon. So with an action potential in the presynaptic cell reaches an action terminal, it induces a localized rise in the level of calcium. So this causes some of the vesicles to fuse with the plasma membrane, releasing their contents into the synaptic cleft. So synaptic cleft, it is the gap you see here in this diagram. So the neurotransmitters diffuse across this synaptic cleft and it takes around 0.5 millisecond to bind them to receptors of postsynaptic cell. Binding of the neurotransmitter, it triggers changes in the ion permeability of the postsynaptic plasma membrane, which changes the membrane's electric potential at this point. If the postsynaptic cell is a neuron, this electric disturbance may be sufficient to induce an action potential. If the postsynaptic cell is muscle, the changes in membrane potential following binding of the neurotransmitter may induce contraction, or if it is a gland cell, then the neurotransmitters may induce hormone secretion. In the nervous system, the neurons are organized in the form of circuits. In complex multicellular animals, various types of neurons form signaling circuits. In the simple type of circuit called as reflex arc, so that is what you see in this diagram, the interneurons connect multiple sensory and motor neurons. So what you can see here, the sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are which sense, and the motor neurons are the neurons which trigger some contraction of the muscles, contraction or expansion of the muscles, which are which carry some motor signal for this nerve muscles. So this simple circuit called as the reflex arc, what you see in this figure, interneurons connect with multiple sensory and motor neurons, allowing the sensory neurons to reflect, sensory neurons to affect multiple motor neurons, and one motor neuron to be affected by multiple sensory neurons. In this way, the interneurons, they integrate and enhance reflexes. So as can be seen in the example in this slide, what you see here, it is a knee jerk reflex in humans, which involves complex reflex arc in which muscle is stimulated to contract. One muscle is stimulated to contract, while the another muscle is inhibited from contracting. So such circuits allow an organism or the human being to respond to a sensory input by the coordinated action of sets of muscles that together achieve a single purpose. So as you can see in this figure, the positioning and movement of the knee joint are accomplished by two muscles that have opposite actions. That means contraction of the quadriceps, here, and whereas the contraction of the biceps muscles behind the legs. So this is the bicep muscle behind the leg, and together this achieves the purpose. Now in this diagram, you see here the schematic diagram of vertebrate nervous system. So there is a central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. So it receives a direct sensory input from eyes, nose, spinal cord. This is the spinal cord, and tongue and ears. Then the peripheral nervous system, it consists of sets of neurons. So there are somatic sensory neurons which relay information to the central nervous system from receptors in somatic and internal organs. Then somatic motor neurons, these are somatic sensory neurons this side, and the somatic motor neurons on the left side. So somatic motor neurons innervate the heart, the smooth involuntary muscles such as those surrounding the stomach and intestine, and glands such as liver and pancreas. The autonomic motor neurons innervate voluntary skeletal muscles, and the autonomic motor neurons innervate the heart and the surrounding and the muscles, involuntary muscles surrounding the stomach and pancreas, intestine, stomach, pancreas, and so on. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic motor neurons, they cause opposite effects on internal organs. The cell bodies of somatic motor neurons are within the central nervous system, and those of somatic sensory neurons, are and of automatic motor neurons are in ganglia adjacent to the central nervous system. So this is just an introduction of our nervous system and how the communication happens in case of nervous system.